But you look at this, and these things are not acting one at a time. They're acting many times in concert, right? And therefore, that's where the cumulative effect has taken place, as well as the level of risk as far as it being compounded. Okay. Just a note here as far as our companies putting risk programs in place. Well, this is from the Institute for Supply Management, said that at least maybe half of the companies are not. So I'm not going to ask you, because I'm sure all of your companies have some level of risk programs. But when I do this with other audiences, there's always that, early adopters that they're doing something. There's others that are, formulating, and there's about a third that have just not gotten started, and they don't know where to start. So there's a huge industry out there. Actually, when I started these programs in 2009, there was virtually nobody there. In fact, if it was, we wouldn't have built these tools internally. We would have bought a process or a subscription. In today's world, there's endless offerings of risk there, all types of risk players in managing risk. So it's very, very replete with a lot of competition there. Okay. I wanted to show you this slide. So while I have the supply chain risk, the IBM Corporation, as big as it has 400,000 people and maybe now 13 divisions. We're very interdependent upon each other. And therefore, we looked at the business and said, we need to manage the risk, not just at a supply chain level, but at an enterprise level. So we actually have a chief risk officer and vice president who's responsible to ensure that each one of our business units has the right level of risk assessment and controls and recovery. So actually, you'll see that chart over there. We sit on that chart. There's 19 top risks in the corporation. Procurement, suppliers is one of those. So we like to keep ourselves on that lower part of the quadrant, that we're low impact and low relevancy, but we're still on the big board there. So we get a chance to present our work every quarter to this body here of this enterprise risk management team. So from a standpoint of managing this across a very complex organization, we've taken those steps, that structure, to put this in place. So hopefully this is not new. Maybe your companies are doing something very similar. So let me just take you back. This is how this got started. We had a senior vice president who asked the chief procurement officer, what are we doing about, and this was in 2009, it was a little article in the Wall Street Journal about Putin shutting off the gas into Hungary, Eastern Europe. What are we going to do about that? Now, we have a lot of suppliers in Eastern Europe. We have a big factory in Eastern Europe, several factories there. And we also just had recently bought a company in Israel, and all those Scud missiles were going around it. We hadn't got a chance to replicate that or move the business. And the chief procurement officer was asked, what are we doing about it? Well, guess what? We're not doing anything about it, because we don't even look at that. Remember, we were looking at whether we're single source or if it was a financial risk. So we never looked at the supply chain. I mean, we just didn't look at this type of thing. So it really caught us flat-footed. And this actually is a part of an email that went from the chief procurement officer to our senior vice president. And he said that we're going to look at everything. We're going to look at all, climatic factors and this and this and this and this. And he listed them. And he talked about work we had done before. So some of the work I had done before was in 1998 on Y2K. So I had educated suppliers around the world and made sure that they were ready and so forth in our applications. And then after that, in 2006, you might remember pandemic was a big issue with the N1 virus and so forth. So we had a very extensive pandemic program dealing with our suppliers and our logistics suppliers at that time. So John Patterson, our chief procurement officer from Scotland, said, we've done work like that before. We're going to launch another piece of work and look at risk in a comprehensive way. Now, part of the joke here was when I was dealing with our chief procurement officer, who's retired now, he said he wanted me to make a tool that would have predicted the Great Recession of September 2008. So I thought it was a joke, but his expectation was very high. So I'll tell you that nothing we have would predict the recession. So of that level. I'm sure we all would have liked to know that it was coming, but nobody knew it was coming. So from here, I actually thought that there were companies out there that were providing this type of service. So I had gone to some of the, as they say in the movies, the usual suspects, and many of them are heavily financially weighted. And we asked them about, what about unemployment? What about, corruption? What about this? And they said, these are great things. And they said, nobody's asked us about this yet. Now this is 2009. And they said, we could start another practice for you. So I thought about this, and them starting another practice sounded expensive. So we had decided actually to build some tools and processes ourselves so that we could actually tailor-make this for what we're looking for. So this is an introduction of how we got into it. This is our story. This might be helpful to you to build on what you have, and by chance, if you haven't started, please start. Please start before something goes awry and you can't get what you need, either goods or services. Now, one of the things, I'm just going to show you through some of the elements here. A strong ingredients here would be an onboarding process. Now, an onboarding process will at least separate the wheat from the chaff. So if you ask the right questions, ask for evidence and so forth, you will separate suppliers that maybe are corrupt, their board of directors have been convicted of felon charges and so forth. So we go through all that information. We also look at whether or not their code of conduct and how their social behavior has been, diversity and so forth. And also in the United States, they have this procurement integrity focus. Any type of supplier that we employ that's doing business with, as they call it, government-owned entity, has to be able to be investigated. So, very high degree. We can separate out, it's not perfect, who's a good player and who's a bad player, or who doesn't have evidence that they can comply. So a strong onboarding process. Now, quite frankly, it's laborious to do this. No one likes this. But when we find something, that got through, the question is, we weren't asking the right questions or we weren't examining the evidence. So let me just pause here. Do you folks have, would you know if you have an onboarding process? Yes, okay. You're admitting to it, okay, very good. We also look at a risk profile. I mean, our level of risk and what we're looking for might be different than yours depending upon your company. So one of the things when I do talk to our clients and we advise them on this is, what's the type of risk you have? What do you want to defend against? What can cripple your supply chain? So here on the production side, we have an electronics profile. Also, our indirect spend is much larger, so we have a different profile there. Developing a process and having line ownership. I will tell you that I'm not in the line at this time, and therefore this really has to be executed by the sourcing team. And the sourcing team is dealing with the supplier. We have found, and maybe you've found, that the suppliers listen to the person who places the business with them, right? They might know the engineers and they might know the environmental compliance people, but they go back to it, they say to the buyer, is this important? And only if the buyer says yes, it's important, do we get that type of action. So embedding this and the other programs that I have with the buying team. Now, I have to tell you, the buying team does not like this, right? I was at a North Carolina State University with one of the premier professors on risk, Dr. Hanfield, and he talked about this being one of the most exciting things, risk and sustainability in the industry. He said, except for the buyer, right? Because the buyer has to carry this, right? Because what does the buyer want to do? They want to get the low price and then reduce it, right? And make sure there's no interruption in supply. And this and all those other programs add to the weight that individual has to carry in dealing with the supplier. And sometimes maybe some of these things are at odds with the pricing scheme. But this is life today. This is procurement 2015, not 1980. So there's a whole big difference here as far as what the scope is and expected of the buying community. Then we looked at, if you're going to do this type of risk thing, it's more than just a cursory look, but it might require an algorithm, might require databases and analytics and so forth so that a decision can be made. And I've titled this Uncovering Risk, because sometimes you really need to kind of clean up things so that you can see with some degree of visibility the things that are not overly apparent, and then maybe the connections. Right? If this happens, and all of a sudden you start seeing how these risks are linked here. Having a risk rating is important as far as defining what's a high risk, what's a low risk, and so forth. Having a business continuity arrangement here. So now that you have a high risk supplier, so what? What are you going to do about it? Are you going to continue doing business with them? Maybe. Will you give them more business? Maybe. Will you take business away? So this, by having this type of visibility, you're able to make that decision even on whether you want to continue with your next package of parts or product. Do you want to give that to that risky supplier there that financially is unstable? Maybe they have their building sitting on an earthquake fault or whatever. Is this where you want to continue putting your business? Maybe it is. Maybe it is.